So the irony is that I'm based here in New York, but okay, we're about to start.
Welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you all here. My name is Suzanne Goldberg. I'm Executive Vice President for University Life at Columbia, and especially pleased to welcome you today to Awakening Our Democracy, Borders, Bans, and Walls. Awakening Our Democracy is a conversation series of the Office of University Life that focuses on pressing issues for the university and for our country and for the world, especially focused on disparities and justice. And today's conversation on borders, bans, and walls could really not be more pressing. It's an issue we have dealt with intensely, many of us, not just for the last weeks, but really for the last months and even today. There's obviously much more going on. Within our university, this is also a deeply salient issue. We have thousands of international students, faculty, and staff, many, many immigrants who are part of and active contributors to our community. And when we think about higher education more generally in the United States, it is run through with issues related to immigration run through higher education in the United States, and immigrants are a fundamentally important part of our educational communities as well as the nation's. And of course, all of us personally have connections to immigration. You can't be in the United States and not. Some personally, some through family, some through friends, and certainly all of us just as we move through the world. In fact, of course, as everybody here knows, New York City is one of the cities in which the greatest number of languages is spoken anywhere in the world, and it is a city intensely filled with and created by and generated by immigrants. So today's panelists, who I will introduce in a moment, will help us sort the historic factors and the future implications of executive action recently on immigration, on travel bans. We'll talk about border protection and control, including the president's recent proposal about a proposal to have a wall between the United States and Mexico. They'll also address many of the questions that you have raised about the tension between the security and safety of the United States, the balance between moral responsibility, sensible policy, and the legacy of a global society that began and continues to form this country. So many of you submitted questions for today. I'll just remind you of a few. What are the cultural factors that have supported President Trump's push for the Muslim ban and the border wall? Are there benefits to building a permanent wall on the US border? Are distinct nations an antiquated concept? What about domestic terrorism? Who are the best experts on national security? What is a sanctuary city? Do you believe that New York City is? And of course, you will have an opportunity during the Q&A portion to raise your questions directly, bring your questions directly into the conversation. So I'd now like to introduce our wonderful panel. Duarte Geraldino maybe you can wave when I say your name, is a special correspondent for PBS NewsHour and our moderator today. He reports on immigration, economics, and race in American culture, and is creating a national archive and a shared resource on the impacts of evolving immigration policy for TED. Previously, Duarte was a national correspondent for Al Jazeera America, and he moderated our very first Awakening Our Democracy panel. We're delighted to have you back. Bitta Mostofi is Assistant Commissioner with New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's Office of Immigrant Affairs. She's a longtime immigrant rights advocate and organizer who has also practiced civil rights law representing Muslim and Middle Eastern petitioners, immigrants, asylees, and others. Kumar is senior attorney with the Center for Popular Democracy, a national organization that works to advance pro-worker, pro-immigrant, racial and economic justice policies at the local and state levels. Kumar previously worked for the International Legal Foundation, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and other nonprofit organizations that provide legal advocacy and criminal defense with a focus on immigration and civil rights. And next to Kumar, we have Tamar Jacoby, who is president and CEO of ImmigrationWorks USA. which is a national federation of small business owners working for immigration reform. Tamar is also a former senior writer and justice editor for Newsweek magazine and was deputy editor of the New York Times op-ed page. She has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, Foreign Affairs, and many other publications, and has authored 2 books on integration and new immigrants in America. So thank you all very much for being here, and Duarte, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. You know, a lot of my research focuses on how U.S. citizens are impacted by deportation. So that's the lens through which I look at this, which means that if we have 11 million people who are at risk of deportation, we can expand that to about 50 million people who are impacted by their potential sudden loss. So I want to turn it to you guys. Immigration and security, that connection is probably one of the most defining issues of our generation, because it will serve as a test of what America tomorrow looks like. So if I could have each of you address this, when we look at an immigration policy that should be in the interests of America, first tell me, what are the interests of America so that we can guide our conversation? We'll start with you, Bitta.
Sure. I want to start by thanking Columbia for hosting this, and to all my panelists and to all of you. You know, I feel like for us, New York City, in terms of how we look at this and how we approach this question, we think that what's not mutually exclusive is the safety of all New Yorkers and the safety of immigrants, right? And so the way that we approach and look at our policies is we think we are, in fact, safer if we are more inclusive. We are truly a city of immigrants. That is, you know, not something we're making up. Approximately 40% of our population is foreign-born. If you add the children of immigrants, that takes you to 60%. That is the fabric of our city. It's who we are, literally. And so you can't separate the safety of New Yorkers from the need to celebrate the inclusivity, to make sure everybody feels comfortable interacting with local law enforcement, reporting crimes. So to have these conversations on separate paths is actually disingenuous. It doesn't actually reflect what we need to be saying, thinking about, and doing to ensure that everybody is in fact safe. And that approach is what dictates many of our local policies on cooperation or non-cooperation with federal immigration enforcement, on confidentiality when anybody, regardless of status, is interacting with local law enforcement. And what we've seen recently in the last few weeks is real fear generated by the kinds of enforcement actions that the Trump administration is taking, preventing people who are victims of crime from coming forward. We've seen domestic violence victims get picked up at courthouses in Denver and other places. This doesn't make us safer. This, in fact, does the exact opposite. And so that question is, I think, a real one and not really being talked about in the most genuine way at the federal level right now.
Thanks, and thank you again to Columbia and fellow panelists. I would actually challenge the premise of that framing, and in general the framing between security and immigration, that somehow immigration is inherently tied into our national security. To me, and I think it's indisputable that the United States is a country of immigrants at its core, and to sort of interrupt that narrative with the idea that immigrants are somehow more likely to be involved in criminality, or that immigrants are more likely to be involved in terrorism, is just a false narrative, and it needs to be, I think, challenged quite forcefully.
To play devil's advocate, to think back so many years ago on 9/11, the image in people's minds is immigrants conducted one of the worst attacks on American history. Right? So that's what you're struggling against. How do you get past that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important first to note that the terrorists involved in that incident were not actually immigrants. I mean, they were non-citizens, and that is a different, I think, concept than who we're talking about, right, of immigrants. Also, the fact is, like the rest of the world, the United States has suffered at the hands of violence from all different sectors of society. And again, that was obviously a horrifying event that clearly set the stage for a lot of what we're dealing with and what impact it had. But it's really important to note that violence is occurring, even terrorism is something that the country is reeling from, even from non-citizens and from immigrants, from citizens, from white people. Just yesterday, I would know, we were speaking about this just before, and I think we can get into this, but here in New York, there was an incident where a man traveled from Baltimore and came to New York with the intent to murder a black person.
He was a white man.
He was a white man, a white supremacist with ties to some sort of organization, and came to New York and actually confronted and murdered an innocent person on the street, and then turned himself in and actually told, apparently, the NYPD that was what his intent was and that's why he was doing it. Now, if that's not terrorism, I'm not sure what is. And I only bring that up just to kind of demonstrate that this is an ongoing challenge for our country in terms of security, but it goes well beyond immigrants or non-citizens or certain ideologies. It's an issue that we need to look at holistically.
So I think all three of us agree that you can have robust immigration and security too. Between 1 million and 2 million people come here every year in the immigration system, either to be permanent residents or on temporary visas. Hundreds of millions of people come here from abroad as travelers and business people. A small sliver of them commit crimes and do bad things. We need a policy that finds that small sliver and ideally finds them before they do bad things. And there's no question that there's parts of the world where a lot of people want to do us harm, and we have to think about what's our policy toward those, towards screening people. Every security person in the world would tell you the best way to screen them is to figure out who's the most likely threat and look at them.
But that opens up a dangerous
well,
box.
I understand, but and let's talk about that. Let's open that up. But the worst danger is when you look at when you treat everyone as if when you treat the whole haystack as if every piece of hay could be a needle. You do have to figure out ways to find out what are your likely needles and look for them. I don't think it should be a racial or a religious test, but there have to be some ways that you zero in on what your priorities are. Every police system in the world does it. No police department treats the shoplifters and the jaywalkers the same way they treat the homicide suspects.
I should say that you occupy a pretty unique position because you are a pro-immigrant immigration Republican.
That's
right?
true.
So it's a very difficult.
I cop to that.
Yeah. I interrupted you, but I want to make sure.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I will get to that. We haven't started to talk about what are America's interests around immigration. Should we pivot to that, or should we stick with the security?
I want to make sure you make your point, because you're arguing that there should be a way to screen folks.
Well, even the Obama administration, every president, every police department, every security agency has a way of trying to figure out who should we look at closely and who is probably going to be, not a problem. Again, every police department in the world, they don't treat the shoplifters the same way they treat the homicide suspects. They try to figure out who are the homicide suspects and give them extra attention. We need to figure out a way to do that. I do not believe it should be on religious grounds, and I don't think most security experts think it should be on religious grounds. But we need some sort of good intelligence to figure out who we're looking at and then look at them closely and try to make sure more 9/11s don't happen.
But on the ground, I echo Kumar and Bitta's point that some immigrants are now afraid to even go and call 911.
Well, that's because President Trump is doing it in exactly the wrong way. Instead of saying we're going to zero in on a few people, he's basically made everyone who's here without papers fair game. It used to be that we looked for people who committed a certain category of crime. And people think there might be who've been convicted of a certain category of crime. Felonies and significant misdemeanors. But the Trump administration has expanded the kinds of crimes that you can be convicted of. It's now said you don't need to be convicted. It's good enough to be charged. We can still deport you. You don't even have to be charged. You can be, if you're chargeable, I mean, what kind of crazy legal category is that? Chargeable. And worse than that, in the eyes of the arresting officer, if you pose a potential security threat or threat to public safety, you're deportable. I mean, that means no priorities. That means they're treating the shoplifters the same way they're treating the homicide suspects, and it's making us, not only is it bad for immigrants and terrifying immigrants, it's making us all less safe because we're not going to find the homicide suspects.
So I hear your concern, but again, to play devil's advocate, the folks who support Trump will say, at least he is making an effort. He is using some available intelligence. And it's a very difficult thing to say, but half the country supports the administration very, very strongly. But if we could focus on New York City, where you have gathered intelligence on a lot of the immigrants with this New York City ID, and there was a bit of friction because there was fear that that information would be weaponized to actually target the immigrants who went and applied for these IDs so that they could function in New York City, but now suddenly that ID may be a bullseye. How did you deal with that, New York City as a sanctuary city?
So the first thing I'll do is correct you in saying that New York City is a sanctuary city. I think the way that we would really talk about who we are as a city is we are a city that believes in inclusivity of all.
So you say it's not a sanctuary city?
I think that sanctuary city itself is a term that could be problematic, right?
Okay.
I think it's in large part can be seen as disingenuous and not actually consistent with the policies that cities put forward or institutions put forward. The history of sanctuary cities, right, is something that sanctuary rather is something that comes up from the 80s, in which faith institutions were declaring themselves sanctuaries for people as places for people to come and seek refuge, in which they would not abide by legal kind of accountability or laws that would make them turn people over, right? That's actually not the way that cities function. That is not the way that institutions that talk about themselves as sanctuary institutions function. What they're saying is that they will put into place policies that are that create protections up into, right, certain legal limitations. And so our purview as New York City is what I said before. We believe that our policies reflect our values, that we are a city that's welcoming to immigrants, that we are our city of immigrants, we are inclusive. But at the same time, we have policies that keep us safe and that keep everybody safe. And there is a limitation, right, in terms of what we can and cannot do as a city. And so I think it's important that as this term gets thrown around, people are very honest about what that means and speaking transparently to communities about what it is in fact possible for cities to do or not to do.
So what can New York City do to protect its immigrants, people who are at risk of harassment, deportation?
Yeah.
What can the city do?
Absolutely. We don't control ICE's ability to be in our streets, right? We don't control ICE's ability to go to particular institutions that are not controlled by the city, et So it's hard to say if you're in New York City, you are completely safe, right? Because ICE can operate in the way that it already operates in many instances, or if they're seeking an individual and they know where that individual is.
To many people in this room, when you say that it's hard to say in New York City you are completely safe, that's pretty scary. And I know that you do a lot of work on that, Kumar.
Yeah, well, what I would want to just react is to maybe talk about what New York City can do more, right, to make this a safer and more...
The people or the city itself?
The city. I think it's really important to recognize that there is in our country and in New York particularly a pipeline that takes many immigrants in communities and funnels them through the criminal justice system into the deportation pipeline. And this president is intending to and has certainly already begun to take a tremendous advantage of that fact. New York City, like many cities around the country, have committed to a form of policing. In New York, we now call that broken windows. And it's something that has been going on in our city for decades, beginning under Rudolph Giuliani, continuing with Michael Bloomberg, and continuing now with Mayor de Blasio. And what you're finding is that local police officers, as they arrest people, as they criminalize behavior that is often not even reaching the level of shoplifting, let alone the level of murder. We're talking about people getting arrested for jumping turnstiles, or for being in a park late at night, or having small amounts of marijuana, which in other states we know is legalized and people are making millions of dollars on. You have immigrants who are being arrested because they live in over-policed communities in New York City, are being taken to precincts and to the court system. They are being fingerprinted, they're being put down into systems, and that information is going to the federal government. And many of those people do end up having immigration consequences as a result of those cases. And that's going to continue to happen unless this city, and advocates have been calling for this for a long time, a progressive city like New York, should rethink the way its police interact with its citizens and reduces the amount of contact between non-citizens, but citizens as a whole, with the police department, and therefore less likely to be subject to the Trump deportation regime.
And this comes back to the choice I was posing. You were saying you don't like having priorities. I'm saying the alternative to having priorities is this. Priorities where you use intelligence, not this kind of intelligence, but in security intelligence, to figure out who is likely to be a terrorist, using real, do they have terrorist connections? Were they in a country where they trained terrorists? Did they go to those training centers? That kind of intelligence, to pinpoint who is a real suspect and focus on them instead of focusing on the turnstile jumpers. And it's a choice. And I believe President Trump is making the wrong choice, and everybody on this panel is in agreement about what the choice should be, which should be focus on the bad guys, not on the turnstile jumpers.
So I'd like to respond and to say that we have a local law that limits cooperation with ICE requests for cooperation to people who've committed violent or serious offenses. The critique that Kumar has just raised is truly a criminal justice critique, right? I work at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. That's not 100% what falls into my purview. What I can say is that what we have seen in this administration is increasingly progressive strides on how low-level offenses are treated. For instance, jumping turnstiles, something that Kumar said. We now issue civil summonses in those instances, meaning you don't get fingerprinted in over 70% of those unless you're a repeat offender. We have decreased the number of arrests tremendously under this administration. We've increased the focus on community policing. There was, in 2016, the Criminal Justice Reform Act that was passed in cooperation with council. There's tremendous progress in this area. Do we ourselves provide these fingerprints to the Department of Homeland Security? No, we don't. Under state law, New York City is mandated to share fingerprints that we take with the state.
So the state can do it?
And the state shares that with FBI. And then the FBI shares that with the Department of Homeland Security.
So
this is not a direct...
So I just want to make sure I understand the chain of command. So New York City cannot share it with the federal government. However,
New York City chooses not to.
Chooses not to, but the city shares it with the state, and they can do whatever they want with that data.
Yeah, we're mandated to under state law to share it with the state.
So how do you respond to that? I mean, what do you think about that? That data is being funneled up.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's, people who are, I mean, I'm not a criminal justice expert, right? But just as a citizen, I don't need to have the fingerprints of every turnstile jumper in a national system, but I do want the fingerprints of every, serious mugger, violent criminal in the system. I think that makes the country safer. So I don't know where we're drawing the line, but I believe in police databases, sure.
What about you, Kumar? So you're rumbling.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. I mean, first, what we're talking about should be clear when I say fingerprints, and I think what we just all agree is happening is that these are fingerprints of people who have been arrested, right? Not necessarily people who have been convicted or who are in prison. I mean, obviously, those people are under supervision and under state supervision and will, that information will clearly be shared with Department of Homeland Security, state agencies. I'm talking about, your average person just happened to be caught, subways come in, or they jump the turnstile, police stop them, take them down the precinct, they get fingerprinted. They might actually get out of jail very quickly and never have any contact again with the criminal justice system, but their fingerprints would be transmitted, whether it's through this state apparatus, or often I think there is an FBI database that police departments use internally that goes up to that. And I do think that's something that we should be concerned about, although it must also be said that what is particularly disheartening and I think very scary, what the Trump administration is doing right now, and they just started last week. They are listing publicly on their website a list of arrestees around the country, non-citizen arrestees, immigrant arrestees, and listing them in a database. Just here are people committing crimes in San Francisco, in New York, just essentially to dehumanize immigrant populations as if they are more likely to commit crimes, to really pinpoint they're doing this, they are doing that.
Do you think it's a
and
dog
that's very
whistle?
dangerous.
So all the research shows
Yeah.
that immigrants are less likely to commit crime than similar native-born people. I mean, there are many fewer Mexican foreign-born people in jail at a certain age percentage than white Americans, than black Americans, whatever. The point is the Trump administration is trying to use these cases to counter that research, to give people the sense that
Fake news.
all immigrants are bad and immigrants are more likely to be criminals, and look at these terrible, dangerous criminals, and forget the guy who's mowing your lawn or being your anesthesiologist or whatever.
I like the comparison. Incidentally, when we talk about these lists, I can't help but think about this wall and the political will that's necessary to actually build this wall. So, from a very real perspective, do you think that the wall as a physical entity and as an idea, do you think it's effective?
So, President Trump is right about one thing. I'm no fan of President Trump. I didn't vote for President Trump. I am a Republican, but I'm not a Trump supporter. But he is right about one thing, that American people want more sense that we have control and we have a sense of national sovereignty. They want to have a sense that we can decide who's coming and going, and we can decide who we are as a nation. And I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. I think if you think about who we are as a nation, and you think about it seriously, you're going to realize immigrants are really good for who we are as a nation. But I don't think it's bad for Americans to think we want to have some more of a say in that. We haven't had enough of a say. It's been out of our control, and we want to think about it a little harder. I don't think that necessarily means they're anti-immigrant. I think the wall is not going to accomplish very much. The wall is not the best means we have to even secure the southern border. The wall is not going to give us that sense of sovereignty. The wall is a symbol, and it's going to be a heck of an expensive symbol and a heck of an insult to one of our best neighbors, the country right to the south, Mexico. So the wall is going to be a big waste of money and not very effective. But the idea behind it, which is that we ought to have a policy more in America's interest, is a good starting point for the debate, but I don't think Trump has a very clear view of what America's interests are, and I don't think the wall is going to serve America's interests.
What's your view from New York?
Yeah. How many of you have been through an immigration process or knows anybody that has been through one?
Raise your hands.
Is it easy? No. I think a lot of people shake their heads. Is it something that's available to a lot of people? Are there a lot of people that can access true sort of status? No. Right? So on the basic level, most people fundamentally understand that it is actually not easy to become a permanent resident in the United States. There's tremendous limitations on who can do it, in what way, by whom, for what purpose. And there is tremendously large amounts of screenings that people go through and verification processes that are already in place. So the notion that this doesn't exist, that we don't control the immigration process, that we don't conduct extensive background and security checks on every single individual that comes through our borders is blatantly false.
Yeah, but,
Trump can't
but
put on
11
that.
million people have
Yes.
come outside of that process in the last couple of decades. I'm for reforming the system, and I think we should have, I don't think we need to cut the numbers, and I think it should be more streamlined, but a heck of a lot of people have come illegally. arguing that maybe we
Sure.
should have a better system for deciding who comes.
Yes, many of the people who have come to our border in the last couple of years have come here seeking refuge and asylum, right? Many of whom have been fleeing massive amounts of violence throughout Central America. And what have we done? We've actually had the Department of Homeland Security recently say that, oh, the deterrent to this is that when parents and children are taken into custody, we're going to continue to detain the parents, but we're going to release the kids
So on that note,
and separate them.
so when we talk about the children, where do they go when the children are separated? Have you seen concrete initiatives here in New York City or anywhere else where they're separating these children, and what happens to them?
This is a new announcement that the Department of Homeland
Yes.
Security has made as a measure that they will take, right, that they have not taken, that would deter immigration. What has happened is when unaccompanied minors have arrived, the Department of Homeland Security assesses if they have a family member, if they have a friend, if they have some sort of support network where they can remain while they're going through immigration proceedings. Here in New York City, we actually did something in response to this that was unprecedented. We said, look, these are children that are truly facing and fleeing real violence. They've been separated from their loved ones and family members. These are not criminals. These aren't people who have chosen to come here because they want to, tour the United States of America. So we placed in immigration courts legal counsel. We placed representatives from the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, connecting these young individuals to resources that the city offers to them for free, regardless of their status, so that while they are here, they're able to access those resources. They're not stigmatized. They're not treated as other.
But to Tamar's point, the very fact that you have to do that suggests that there is a wave of immigrants that we have no control over.
And I'm not saying keep them out. I'm saying if we're going to accept, we should. And these kids are not actually the issue. I mean, we do have an asylee process. It's not working all that well right now. It is overwhelmed. That's not the main place that the immigration system is broken. The main place the immigration system is broken is most of the reason the 11 million have come over the past 30 years, not just the past 3 or 40 years, is because we don't have enough visas for people who want to come work here. If you want to come work on a farm, there's a visa program for you. If you're a PhD scientist, there's a visa program for you. They're too bureaucratic and they need to be fixed, but there are programs. If you're a Mexican with no family here and you want to come work in a year-round job, you have a really hard choice. You can hire a smuggler and walk across the desert, or you can hire a smuggler and walk across the desert. There's no other way. And that's why there are 11 million people here outside of the law. The answer is not to keep them all out. The answer is to figure out a way, if we actually need them to do jobs here, we need to figure out, do we need them to do jobs here, and then we need to let them in legally.
Right, and I mean, I think that's the point. We all agree with that, but that's really the reason why even the concept of a wall is both unnecessary, expensive, and I do think dangerous. We've spent, centuries in our country building a nation of immigrants, as we just talked about, and of people who have, Native Americans and people descendants of slaves, and that's our country, right? Like, the idea that all of a sudden now we're going to rethink the way our sovereignty and our concept of our American identity, particularly with the Republican Party right now under Donald Trump, and I think a lot of other enablers in that party, their vision of America doesn't involve immigrants. It doesn't involve the people that really make up the identity of this nation.
Are you suggesting their vision for a future of America doesn't involve immigrants, doesn't involve...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they've already said that he campaigned on the concept that he wanted to have a deportation force and throw out 11 million people. He campaigned on putting in a permanent, practically ban of Muslim immigrants to this country.
So there's a race in...
Yeah, absolutely, there's a race element. He campaigned on the idea of sending in federal troops to out-of-control urban environments. He campaigned on a racialized message of what America is, and it is no coincidence that his senior advisors are Breitbart editorial directors, right, which has a very dark vision of our country. So it's important to think of when he talks about the wall, when he talks about bans, when he talks about immigration policy, that it's anchored in that framing. And not doing that does a disservice to how we confront and move past that.
So I have no quarrel with your description of Donald Trump or Steve Bannon or Steve Miller, his top immigration advisor. I do think they have let's call it at the best a xenophobic vision of America, and they want to cut even legal immigration in half. I don't think that's the majority view in the Republican Party, and I can go to chapter and verse on that. I think the majority view in the Republican Party is skeptical of illegal immigration, but not necessarily opposed to legal immigration, and not necessarily opposed to fixing the system so that it works better. And I'll cite a long line of Republicans that I've worked with in Washington, starting with President Bush and John McCain, and even Paul Ryan is on record as being for immigration reform. There are a lot of people in the Republican Party who would like to fix the immigration system.
They had a chance, and they didn't.
No, they didn't have a chance. They haven't been president.
No, but
there's been a Democratic president for the last 8 years.
There was a bipartisan bill out of the Senate, which was ended in the House under Republican control. They had a chance to pass it.
Because Obama acted on an executive action and destroyed their trust that he would enforce it. I mean, I live there, I work, I sleep in the tunnels underneath the Congress.
We have 3 minutes before we're going to open the floor to questioning. If you could just briefly, in 30 seconds, each of you, address how the changing patterns of immigration. So back in the earliest part of our country's history, there was a particular immigrant the country wanted, and now that's changing. If we could start with you, just 30 seconds, and how we should look at the immigrants that we want today versus how we were restricting them even 50 years ago.
300 years of history in 30 seconds, that's hard.
Quick.
We didn't really restrict them until the 1920s. We had there were some, Asian Americans have been restricted since about the 1880s, but pretty much we said, if you can come here and make a life, come and make a life, until the 20th century. Then in the 20th century, we had very, very restrictive laws from 1924 to 1965, and then we started opening it up, but we opened it up mostly to relatives. Whereas in lots of other countries, it's based on the workers we need, or some mix, a little different balanced mix of more the workers we need and not so many relatives.
So we need to kill the nepotism?
Well, I mean, I think we could rebalance it a little bit and have 60, right now more than 2/3 of the immigrants come because they're related to someone, and only about 5% come because we need them as workers, 7%. I think we could balance that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's an open question. Why do we need certain caps on immigration from certain regions or certain people or certain demographics? I think that throughout history, we need to be aware of the fact that the government did willfully exclude certain people. Right? There was literally a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Right? There were laws that capped the number of Irish and Jewish immigrants for a long time. That was lifted. It's also no coincidence that the law that was passed in the 1960s that finally kind of opened up the door to more immigration occurred during the same time as the Civil Rights era, because these were civil rights issues. And so I think we need to think about immigration right now clearly as a civil rights issue. It is a racialized issue. And I do obviously believe that we need to continue to vet who comes to our country. We're already doing that. We vet it takes years in terms of refugees and asylees. We need to keep doing that. But the idea to shut down, build walls, permanent bans, even temporary bans, I think is very dangerous. And we need to really be aware of where that is coming from.
Perfect. So, brief comment?
Yeah, I'm going to actually not use that comment. I'm going to talk about ID/NYC because that got completely missed from your question, which is to say that are people familiar with the ID/NYC card? No, some people. This is the New York City ID card that anybody who's 14 years of age and older is eligible for, as long as you can say, this is who I am and I live in New York City. We don't ask immigration status. We don't record immigration status. The beauty of this program is that it's open to everybody. We conducted an evaluation over the summer of the participants who responded. We had thousands and thousands of respondents who had the card. We have over 900,000 cardholders currently. 77% of them said that the card made them feel more like a New Yorker. It made them feel proud to be in the city.
But the government then wanted that data to be able to find these people. Is that not true?
That's actually not what happened. So 2 state assembly members from Staten Island filed a Freedom of Information Law request for information that the program had on cardholders. We, as a city, have fought that request. That is actually not the purpose of FOIL, right? It is not intended to breach the privacy and confidentiality of individuals. It is something that's intended for public interest. There's no public interest there, certainly not for state assembly members to have this information or to have that be public. We are confident as a city that we can protect our cardholder information. We have our local law behind us, which says that we will protect it to the maximum extent possible under the law, and we have continued to do that. No information has been released pursuant to that request, and we are committed to fighting it and confident that we will win.
A lot of people are hoping that victory comes, but a good chunk of that population are immigrants who use these cards. Is that correct?
As I said, we don't record immigration status. What I can tell you is that many people who have the card have identified as immigrant.
Okay, so let's open up the floor to questions. So if 3 students could ask questions, and please state which school you were part of, and then we'll have the panelists answer it. There is a mic over here.
My name is Maria Morataya Mayes. I am a senior in Columbia College. And before I continue with my question, I would just like to acknowledge that we are on Lenni Lenape land, and just to give credit to where it is due. So my question is for each of you, and Mr. Duarte, if you could also answer. And you began this panel by saying, what are the objectives, or what are the, I guess, the driving factors of current immigration policy? And I'm wondering if you can answer to that. So essentially, who is benefiting from these changes in immigration policy? Also speaking to the fact that upon Trump's election, the stock in private prison industries increased monumentally. And what is something that each of us, regardless of immigration status, just being consumers here in the United States, can do to have an impact on immigration policy, if there is anything? Thank you.
We're going to get to 2 more questions, and then we can, if not, we can go with that one. Any more questions? So you heard a question. So who benefits, and I want to let you answer first, but who benefits from the proposed immigration policy?
I don't think anybody benefits.
Excuse me?
I don't think anyone benefits. I think it's bad for immigrants. It's going to be bad for the economy. It's going to be bad for America's image abroad. I don't see a single person benefiting, except Donald Trump, is going to be popular with his supporters, and only with his supporters, who are a small faction of the country.
Those are strong words as a Republican.
What?
Those are strong words as a Republican.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably agree with most of that. I do think what the questioner raised around private profiteering is a very important element to this, which is the fact that there are a group of people who are set to benefit from mass detention and deportation policies, which are private detention and prison companies. There's 2 in particular. There's one called now called Core Civic. It used to be called CCA. Another called the GEO Group. Large international corporations, publicly funded or publicly traded on stock exchanges, and actually funded by big banks here in New York. Their stock has already risen since the election. They lobby congressmen and politicians. They help pay for Donald Trump's inauguration. They're looking to make money on this, and as of now, they already have made some money. And if we continue to go down the path we are, which is mass deportation, mass detention, and mass criminalization of not just immigrants, but even our citizen populations, communities, there is a group that's set to profit off of this, and I think is in part driving this.
I think I'll take up the last part of her question, which is like, what can we do, right? I think that this is a time now more than ever that really it's on every individual to think about what their role is in this moment. Do you know who your neighbors are? Do you know if that they're safe, that what their concerns are? Do you know that people that you work with consistently know what their rights are? Have they been educated on the resources that are available to them? Or if they have questions, are they connected to legal services, et cetera? I think some of the most interesting things that I've personally seen that's happening right now is some of the community level organizing and conversations around how, you know, we can resist together, right? How can we create communities and responsiveness at the local level, at the community level, so that we aren't leaving vulnerable populations behind as some of these policies move forward, and so that the fear doesn't generate such a rampant kind of retreating to the shadows, if you will, of individuals or people living in fear, not coming forward, not going to hospitals or health clinics or sending their kids to school or et cetera. That's not good for any of us. And so it's really, I think, on all of us, you know, not just the city, not just advocates, et cetera, but on every single one of us to take ownership of what our role can be in this moment.
It would seem that the whole notion of this discussion that's so polarizing with immigration would stand to benefit both sides in the sense that there are a lot of people who are afraid, but a lot of those folks have supporters who are willing to get out and protest, as we have seen all over the country. And one could argue pretty successfully that that is setting the framework for a new force during the midterm elections because we have all these protests. So in that sense, there is a true benefit to folks who are against this policy because there's so much outrage, so much anger right now. The challenge, and it is a huge one, is how to channel that rage, that angst, that passion into voter turnout, which, as we saw in pockets outside of New York City, just weren't there, simply weren't there. Now, you speak a lot about how to resist.
Right.
And as a journalist, I'm not saying you should resist or not, but as someone who works with resistance,
right,
what do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critical that we tackle this. You know, the fact is we're in a very vulnerable position, and I really do believe that democracy as a whole is under attack, as much as individual families and communities are under attack. But it is true that I do think we have power in numbers. And in terms of resistance, we've seen some successes already, both in courthouses, in protests, in even Trump administration altering some of their executive actions or legislation that's being blocked or being challenged. I think it's really important, though, for all of us to engage at the local level. I would definitely mirror that. There is a lot of gap between people's lives and living in the community and all the way what's happening in Washington, D.C. But there are things that people can be doing and should be doing in their own towns, right? Support local community organizing that's happening around immigrant rights or around democratic participation. We can push for having the ability for non-citizens even to vote locally. That's something that even New York City has, looked into and potentially might happen someday. We have local races, even at school boards and at municipal level, not just here in New York City, which is like its own country, but even at small towns around the country. People can get engaged and need to get engaged, and they need to confront their elected officials to be accountable to what they want to see out of them. We've seen the benefits, as you referenced, to this movement that's happening all around the country with people showing up at their congresspersons' town halls. And a lot of congresspersons, some of them, to their credit, actually showed up and engaged with angry constituents, but a lot just didn't show up. It's going to be a big question whether they're going to survive 2018 if they don't show up at their town halls. So I do think that engaging at the local level is critical. We're not going to be able to get in front of Donald Trump or his Twitter account, but I think we can get in front of our local officials, and you can get out with your community and resist in the way that's power building for you and your family and your community.
So I think there's lots of different ways to affect change, right? And I don't live in the streets organizing locally. I do live in Washington. I work in Washington. I work in Congress, trying to influence Congress. And I think the resistance is really important, but we're also never going to get real change unless we can get members of both parties for it, right? Like, we're not going to fix the system, and we're not going to, you know, all the things we're talking about the system doesn't work, even at the small level of fixing the priorities or fixing the processing, never mind deciding in a more rational way how many people come and how we decide who that is. That's never going to happen with one party alone. And so the idea that of the demonizing all Republicans, I would urge even the people who are resisting to be careful of demonizing all Republicans, because they're going to need some pro-immigration Republicans to eventually fix it. And, you know, what I'm trying to do now is focus on a small piece in Washington, is focus on a small piece, which are the DACA kids, right? So President Obama protected 750,000 young people who came here, were brought here illegally as children, no choice of their own, the dreamers. 750,000 of them came forward and asked for permission to stay, and we granted it under the Obama administration. Trump said on the campaign trail many times, I'm going to rip it up when the first day. Well, you know, thank God it's day 50, whatever it is, and he hasn't ripped it up yet. And I and other people are working really hard to make sure that the administration doesn't rip it up and to try to build support, even in a Republican Congress, for protecting these kids. And so there's many different ways to fight this, and resistance is one of them, but, you know, I would argue that resistance isn't the only one, and I would urge people who are resisting to be careful what bridges we burn, because, you know, and I'm not saying you have to be praising the Republican Party, but it is going to take eventually Democrats and Republicans to fix the system.
I want to make sure, are there any questions in the audience? We'll get a mic for you. I can hear you and I can rephrase, but we'll get a mic towards you.
I think there's a couple others.
Yeah. So why don't we ask the three questions and then?
Yeah. Can you bring it up a little closer? All right.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm a senior at Columbia College. So my question today, and something that I've wondered all along in this conversation of immigration as a whole, is to what extent do we think that the U.S. can solely fix this immigration problem, and in terms of putting a new policy in place, but that doesn't really take care of the 11 million illegal immigrants that are fleeing another circumstance. So to what extent is there some major role to be played in actually fixing different situations that give birth to this immigration? My question is, to what extent can the U.S. help, or does the U.S. have a role in doing that?
Next question.
Since New York, I'm Linda from the School of Professional Studies. My question is about New York City being defined as a sanctuary city, and I'm still very unclear about what that really means. But the question going forward is, it's my understanding that when de Blasio met with Trump, he told Trump that this was a sanctuary city and we were going to retain that status. It's also my understanding that Trump said that if mayors such as de Blasio go rogue and do things that would go against that definition, then the federal government can rescind federal funds. So it's very confusing. I mean, what activities would get Trump to say de Blasio has gone rogue and we're going to rescind federal funds?
So we want to be able to answer both those questions. Are there any more? I'll
do the first one.
You do the first one? Okay.
You want me to do that first, or you want to do this first?
Okay.
So Immigrants leave their homes and go to a new place for a lot of different reasons, right? Sometimes it's poverty in the place. Sometimes it's actually they're doing a little better in the place and they need some more money. But it's also really often what's going on in the place they're going to. So experts talk about the difference between push factors and pull factors. And I would argue that in America, the waves go up and down. A lot of the immigration here has to do with pull factors, right? So the number I always say, if you need to know one number to understand immigration in the last like 50 years, it's that in 1950, half of all the American-born workers in the workforce were high school dropouts. Half of them. And that meant they wanted to do physical work. They wanted to work outside on roofs. They were happy cleaning hotel rooms. They were happy in working on farms. Now less than 10% of the American workers in the workforce are high school dropouts. So we actually need a lot of people who are willing to and eager to work in hotel rooms, work on roofs, and have their kids have a better life and potentially get to the middle class. And we also need a lot of PhD scientists that we didn't used to need. We have a global innovation economy now. So a lot of the immigration to the US is actually pull factor driven rather than supply side driven. I mean, and you saw that in the downturn, the illegal immigration shrunk by about 3/4 or 4/5 during the downturn, just because people at home in Mexico heard, well, they're not actually building houses in Las Vegas, why should I go there? So yes, we can do things about other countries, but actually, I think the main place we have to think about as the driver of immigration is what's happening here, and that would argue for more robust immigration. And we're actually going to be in trouble when Mexico gets to be a middle-class country. We're going to wonder where to find the roofers and the hotel cleaning ladies.
Very interesting.
I'd actually challenge some of that with the idea that it's been exclusively or even predominantly a pull factor.
I didn't say exclusively.
Okay, but even I think it's important to acknowledge that we can look at both Central America and certainly the Middle East. We have thousands of refugees.
Tiny numbers in the bigger scheme of things.
Sure, but it's important to acknowledge that the U.S. has an outsized role in creating conditions, particularly I think in North Africa and the Middle East, that resulted in the refugee crisis that we are in. Second, in terms of Central America, it is also true that the United States has had a major outsized role and influence on the economies and the political conditions in those countries. In Honduras particularly, the United States has had its hand, and it's both under Republican and Democratic presidents, to influence and destabilize, and what not necessarily their intent, but it's happened, and that's a lot of the folks coming to the United States, particularly in the last few years, are fleeing political violence and narcotic violence, and there is absolutely a U.S. role in, I think, creating some of those situations, whether it was intentional or not. Certainly the United States has a role in helping fix those. And, I think that it's important to acknowledge that there's a dual function there.
Thank you for sharing that, because that was important.
I'm going to take, obviously, her question and say that the first executive order on immigration that the president wrote essentially looked at cities that were potentially sanctuary cities. I think the important thing to state, and this is what I was getting to earlier, is there's no legal definition of a sanctuary city. It doesn't exist. It's a made-up term, and in fact, in many ways, it's been used to demonize rather than speak positively about what some cities are doing. That executive order sought to define, it was the first time that a legal document started to try to define what a sanctuary city was or wasn't, and essentially threatened that should a city become or be deemed to be one of these cities, federal funding could be taken away. The important thing to note about that is it's not clear who they see as falling under their definition or even what that looks like. The second thing that's important to note is there's been no attempt or action to put that into practice or to seize funding or to threaten funding legitimately. We as a city are confident that what we do makes sense, that we are in fact, as I said, abiding by the letter of the law. There's nothing that mandates a city to deputize its law enforcement as immigration enforcement. In fact, that is something that cities voluntarily have to choose to do, and we have said, and Mayor de Blasio has reaffirmed that we will never deputize our law enforcement officers to become immigration agents, that our laws and policies make sense. As I said earlier, we are a city that's welcoming to immigrants, we're inclusive of them. We will continue to do that while maintaining public safety. We don't think these things are mutually exclusive. And the last thing to say is that we think we can fight whatever attempt there might be to come forward and try to essentially enforce policies. There is federal overreach. There is a constitution that limits what they can and cannot do. There have been successful advocacy attempts by cities to push back on this kind of policy or attempt to get at cities through Congress before. We are part of a national coalition that includes Republican mayors called Cities for Action that believe that the attempts to impose these kinds of policies on cities are harmful and that we will resist them if in fact they are realized. And the last thing I'll say on that piece is if you look at the funding streams that they threaten to take, many of that, it goes to counterterrorism work that New York City does. It goes to our policing work. That doesn't make anybody safer, to go back to your first question, and we will resist that.
So we are winding down now, so I'd like briefly, just 30 seconds, a final thought, what you want everyone here to go away with. We'll start from that side.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to a couple things you said, actually. I am a pro-immigration Republican, and in that makes this a very hard time for me. And I think the country is in for a hard time on immigration policy. I think the hard time is going to be, again, a number you cited. If there's 11 million people here who are unauthorized, that's probably 50 million people who are affected when parents get deported and other things happen. And I think the whole country does have to figure out how we're gonna help those people. And then I think even bigger threat is going to be the threat of the Trump view to legal immigration, because I think President Trump wants to cut legal immigration in half, and I think that's as bad as wanting to go after the unauthorized people. But I think it is really important as we think about how we're going to ever get to the end, come out of this tunnel and fix it, not to demonize all Republicans and to look for ways to make things better, even if it involves maybe some compromises, with Republicans in the short term, and a vision of a future that is looking for broader change that's bipartisan.
Yeah, I think it's important for those of us who are interested in maintaining the United States as a place for immigrants, as a place that we're proud to be an immigrant-rich country, for us to have a positive and affirmative agenda. So we're going to spend a lot of time, as we will, trying to fight back against Trump and resist, and where he overreaches or where things are out of bounds, we'll continue to fight back. But I think it's as important for those of us interested in maintaining our character of our country to present a positive agenda, to push for local legislation, for state legislation, support Congress people and local officials who are really doing that hard work. And so I think that we shouldn't get caught up into only kind of it being in a defensive crouch. We should be out there kind of striking back and getting ready to raise the stakes of what it means for certain partisans to be taking a certain side, right? Like whether it's Republican or otherwise. I think it's important we develop that agenda, and it's already happening, and you're seeing it, and it's important for us to take advantage, as you said, of the energy and the sort of agitation and channel that into something positive and multi-issue and multiracial coalition building, and again, I think it is true we should not demonize Republican voters. I think Republican officials are another issue, but yes, we do, I think, need to reach out and understand who's voting for Trump and make it clear that many of the policies that he's put forward, including on immigration, will hurt them and are going to hurt our country. And I think we need to bring them into the fold.
Make sure you have enough time.
Yeah, I agree with much of what has been said, so I won't repeat that. I will sort of go back to what I said earlier, which is that I think there's a role for everybody in this moment. I think if you care about this issue or other issues, it's a time to get organized, to educate, to get involved, and there's many avenues to do that. And so, you know, my kind of 2 cents would be, don't sit on the sidelines. It's not good for any of us to do that, and it's so important in this moment to get involved. Our office, I can say this, we developed, this is a pretty easy thing to do. We developed a one-pager that just talks about resources that are available to immigrant New Yorkers regardless of their status, from health services to IDNYC to schools and mental health assistance and in the language that you speak is so essential. Immigration, legal services for free, so important that you're connecting people to these kinds of resources and that you're getting involved. You can learn about these initiatives, you can volunteer to go to community events. My office has done over 200 forums since the election of Know Your Rights forums, connecting people to resources, bringing in immigration attorneys to give Know Your Rights workshops and trainings. We're doing that in schools now. So really, education, getting involved, organizing. If you're not going to do it now, I don't know when you are.
Thank you so much. And one final thing that I'd like to leave you with, I mean, you are all so incredibly powerful. The trick is just recognizing that. Every dollar you spend, everything you read, everyone you talk to is a vote in favor of the future that you want. So just recognize that and use that power. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to suggest one way before I thank our panelists for you to use the power, which is to share out video of today's conversation. You'll find it on the University Life website shortly and on our social media. And please do share it out because it's a very important way to really amplify the tremendous conversation that we've had today. I do want to thank all of our panelists. Let me give you 2 quick announcements too. The University Life office can always connect students and others in our community with the resources at Columbia. International Students and Scholars Office, of course, helps all international students. University Life office can also connect you with discussion groups. Students who are DACA and undocumented also can obtain resources through our office. And I want to invite you also to join next Thursday at 7 for Story Space, which is University Life's storytelling series that features the stories of students from across the university. It's next Thursday evening at 7, and some stories actually will be addressing this issue among others. Now, please join me in thanking our panelists for really an outstanding conversation. Thank you so much.